This is The Red Line. We interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. It was only a few years ago that Tripoli, the capital of Libya, looked like it was about to fall to Haftar's forces from the east, and people assumed that this would be the end of the Tripoli government and of the bloody Libyan civil war. But as things seemed to be coming to an end, Erdogan and Turkey appeared on the scene to back the Tripoli government, and unlike the French or the Italians, they brought air power with them. Not the expensive F-16s they own. No, Turkey has far too few of them, and frankly they're far too expensive to be risking in a campaign like this. Instead, Turkey came with the Bayraktar TB2 drone, an unmanned aerial combat drone that, whilst not as good as the US MQ-9, was more than good enough to combat Haftar's forces, and in a very short space of time, was able to absolutely pummel their supply lines and push Haftar's forces all the way back to the city of Sirte, and pulled off the kind of victory you'd expect from the top-of-the-line Reaper drones. But instead, they pulled it off at a fraction of the price. Fast forward again to the back half of 2020, as Azerbaijan launches a full offensive to take back the Armenian-held territories around Karabakh, armed with those same cheap Turkish drones, which once again proved to be decisive. They swept aside the Armenian tanks and destroyed most of them before they even reached the front lines. Rather than the Azeris' expensive Su-25s or MiG-29s being the decisive force on the battlefield, like I'm sure the brochure advertised they would be, it was these cheap, unmanned Turkish drones that won the day. Fast forward again to Ukraine in 2022, and the exact same thing happens again. Moscow began losing some of their very expensive cutting-edge aircraft. Looking at the higher price tag, Moscow stopped putting these aircraft in harm's way. After all, they're too precious to be risking over the front lines of Ukraine. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, well, they had these cheaper Turkish drones, which they were more than willing to use. The war quickly became about economics and cheap drones, rather than who had the fastest plane. In just the short space of time, the US had begun their drone program, and nations like Turkey have made it cheap and easy enough to be accessible. Air forces all around the world are now rethinking their force makeup. However, whilst air forces all around the world are wondering if a fleet of cheap drones might be more practical than one or two F-35s, the next game changer is already starting for those who know where to look. The next one isn't in the air, but it's in the sea. And it's not with UAVs, but with UUVs. Unmanned Underwater Vehicles, UUV, which, just like a UAV, possess many of the same qualities that make them such a desirable option. For one, they don't have a pilot inside to be captured if it malfunctions behind enemy lines. They don't require life support systems to keep the entire ship's crew alive. And for three, they have the ability to stay out at sea far, far longer than any submariner could do whilst maintaining any sort of marriage. But most importantly, just like the UAVs compared to the fighter jets of the time, these UUVs were a fraction of the price of their mammoth multi-billion-dollar submarine counterparts. These UUVs are ticking all the same boxes, but for a fraction of the price. And unlike with UAVs, those in the know aren't waiting around for the concept to be proven in Libya again. Instead, they're already beginning to change their naval makeups. UUVs are likely to be the biggest shakeup of national navies in nearly a century, not only for how it restructures the nation's reconnaissance or payload delivery capabilities, but also for which nations can now afford to get into the submarine game. Far too many people failed to realize just how much UAVs would change the shape of the modern battlefield. The question is, will those same people make that mistake again and fail to realize how much UUVs are set to change the battle at sea? Well, that's the question we're going to be answering today. What UUVs are capable of, how they're going to change the battlefield, and why it's so important to be on the front foot with this one. And to get us started and take us through just what UUVs are capable of, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. A Sinking Suspicion.
In the same way that drones are changing the nature of air warfare and land warfare, AUVs or autonomous underwater vehicles are on the cusp of changing undersea warfare. They are the technology that is most likely to change things going forward, and potentially they could democratize navies in the same way that you could argue that drones and uncrewed combat air vehicles in particular, so weaponized drones in the air, are very rapidly changing air warfare.
H.I. Sutton is an independent defense analyst specializing in naval technology and underwater warfare. He's also one of the most highly regarded naval analysts anywhere in the theatre, being one of the go-to sources for journalists, analysts, and national governments when it comes to naval developments, with much of his fantastic and detailed analytical work laid out on his website and YouTube channel under the name H.I. Sutton, or Covert Shores. And we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
The biggest programs, the most ambitious ones, are largely with main power navies and the Australian Navy, if you want to call that a main power navy as well. Having said that, smaller AUVs, smaller uncrewed underwater vehicles, are quite accessible to small navies. And part of what we might see in the future is that they become accessible to small navies, particularly through export from larger navies or countries that have larger navies. So it potentially is a technology that will change the balance of which navies have how much power, essentially.
Now, in recent weeks and days, we've actually seen a number of attacks in the Black Sea on Russian surface ships, many of these coming from very cheap to produce improvised drone jet skis filled with explosives. And with this following the sinking of the Moskva last year, the Russian surface fleet has been seen as a little underwhelming in its capabilities. But whilst many continue to keep their focus on the Russian surface fleet, the Russian submarine fleet has always been where Moscow prioritizes its spending and development, as well as R&D, and has been the main priority of the Russian Navy for years. Whilst the Russian and Soviet surface fleets almost always lacked behind their NATO counterparts, the Russian submarine fleet was often on the cutting edge or a near competitor, with submarines like the Yasen, Bory, and Typhoon classes often punching way above their weight. But the USSR was a long time ago, and the Russian military no longer has near the finances it once did. So how does the Russian submarine program today compare to what it used to be? Are they still sitting on the cutting edge, going toe-to-toe with NATO forces, or have they fallen behind, particularly when it comes to this UUV theatre?
It's interesting because the Russian nuclear-powered submarines are really top tier. They are no comparison in either a technical or a crew competency perspective than the surface ships, or especially the land army and air force for that matter. They are the absolute cream of the Russian armed forces, and from a technical perspective are extremely threatening to NATO, to US, to Britain, and to other Western countries. Having said that, although Russia has a long history of AUVs and has certain spaces where it's in some respects ahead, if I were to step back, I'd say that they've actually fallen behind, mainly because of a lack of investment in the 20-year period after the end of the Cold War. And they are trying to come back, but the leading programs for uncrewed underwater vehicles are no longer in countries like Russia, and they're getting behind. So there's an imbalance there. They're still absolutely top notch when it comes to nuclear submarines, but they're weaker when it comes to AUVs.
So obviously countries do see the value in UUVs at the moment, as there's quite a number of players entering this space currently. But what sort of capabilities does a UUV actually give a navy that a conventional submarine wouldn't?
Countries at the cutting edge, such as China, are developing ever larger UUVs, and these are going to be able to take on roles that traditionally would have been assigned to crewed submarines. So quite different from the types of AUV that you just drop over the side of a boat. These are essentially full-size submarines minus the crew. So they're still smaller than a full-size submarine because you don't need to carry all that crew around. But they're very large, very long-ranged. Because they're uncrewed, they'll be able to use them in high-risk situations where they might not risk a crewed submarine. So the employment, the tactics could evolve, but also we're starting to see the signs of them being weaponized or armed in the same way that we've seen that in uncrewed air vehicles, of course, UAVs. And that is a major shift, because what is fundamentally different about the undersea environment is it's very hard to communicate with things. So you need to have a very high level of automation. You can't realistically have a person in the loop. So if you're going to put a torpedo on a AUV, it implies a level of autonomous target acquisition and decision making. And that raises all sorts of ethical and legal concerns, but I think it's inevitable. And countries such as China, we're starting to see that already. And China are not alone. I think over the next several months, really, it's really happening right now. Most, or if not all, of the main AUV programs will reveal that they're at least thinking about arming their AUVs with weapons such as torpedoes. We've seen it in South Korea just in the last few months, but China would be the big one to watch there.
Now, just like conventional submarines, UUVs come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. and fill a whole variety of different roles. So can you take us through how something like a glider UUV compares to something like a US Orca UUV, a much larger vehicle at about 51 feet in length? How do these different types of vehicles power themselves, and what sort of different role are they going to play when it comes to their naval operations?
So to put it into perspective, most UUVs that people are familiar with or see, at least the mental image, is something that's quite small. And even with lithium-ion batteries, these are going to have a range measured in nautical miles, a few nautical miles, and maybe a few days. Of course, the stats that get published are always a bit more impressive than the reality, but they are quite small. Then when you scale it up to something like the Orca that the US Navy's building, they can start to go for weeks and cover thousands of miles. Each design has different power plants. At the moment where we are, every design is different, but the main power plants, the Orca is using a diesel electric power plant similar to what you'd find on a conventional submarine. Some other designs, the cellular one, which I think Australia is investing in, that uses a fuel cell, so it doesn't have a diesel engine on it at all. It has similar very long range, and others who just have a lot of lithium-ion batteries. So they can go for hundreds, if not thousands of nautical miles, stay around for a few weeks and conduct potentially quite strategic missions. A glider is a completely different category. That, on paper, has the longest range. It can go many thousands of miles because it doesn't use normal propulsion as you'd imagine it. What it does is it adjusts its buoyancy, so it starts to sink, and it has wings, so it converts that sort of downward gravity, the sinking, into forward momentum, and it glides underwater, getting deeper and deeper. And then when it gets to a certain depth, it registers that and it changes its buoyancy and it floats back up to the surface very slowly, doing the same thing. And it can do this just many, many times, so it goes an incredibly long distance. It's actually longer range than the Orca. But the downside is it has very limited control over its location. It can't navigate in the same way. It can't keep to a route. It basically is at the mercy of the currents and so on. So they have different applications.
One of the major uses for UUVs appears to be reconnaissance and mapping operations, either mapping things like the geography of the sea floor or the traffic and layout of enemy ports. But there are also talks that the more sophisticated UUVs can do things like map the unique electromagnetic signature of a particular enemy sub, so you can tell when that submarine is coming and going from port. These sort of mapping and reconnaissance operations, is that something these UUVs will likely have a particular knack for going forward?
A lot of UUVs at the moment are being used for mapping the seafloor. In a military sense or in a Navy sense, that is a type of intelligence gathering. It is a spy mission, because mapping the seafloor allows other submarines and or anti-submarine efforts to be much more effective in future. You're knowing the terrain of where you're going allows you to navigate underwater without coming to the surface, for example. But they also do a lot of measurements which are less obvious to people. For example, they'll look at the how much salt is in the water at different depths, how the currents are moving, and even just picking up ambient noise and measuring ambient noise. This is equally useful for hiding submarines. If you know about submarine warfare, you know a lot of it is about noise. And if you know the local environment before your submarine enters that area, then it can better adjust and hide itself more effectively. So it's a lot of data. It's not very sexy, but it can be incredibly powerful. And especially if you gather it over a long period of time, in great detail. One very specific mission might be to gather the noise signatures of certain ships or submarines and so on. That can be quite hard, especially in the open ocean, because the chances of a submarine passing you are slight. But if you park one of those types of devices off a particular port, then you can, of course, gather that information, and you can use other sources such as satellite imagery or other forms of intelligence to know which ship it was that you were listening to, and put the two and two together, and you can get the acoustic signature of that ship. So many uses for that. Obviously, if a submarine later hears that ship, they will know which ship it was. Potentially down to the individual ship, but almost certainly to the class of ship. But more surprising, they could put that same information into a smart mine, and then they could place a mine in that location, and it would only detonate if that particular ship passed it. So that's the reason that you would go after something that might seem an odd thing to go to be looking for.
How sneaky are these UUVs though? Do they have the capability to do things like lay mines or tracking devices in enemy harbors or naval choke points without being detected?
Yes, and I think that AUVs have some obvious advantages in this. Firstly, in terms of laying mines or large listening devices, you have to have a large vehicle, and you probably need to do it over a long distance as well, and that's why AUVs are getting larger, certainly the ones that navies are looking at. We term them at the moment, we call them extra large UUVs, something typically over 10 meters long, but sometimes 20 meters long. And that's big enough that it can start laying mines and things like this. Smaller ones can't necessarily do that, at least not in the same way, but they can still gather intelligence. The advantages of UUVs are that they're uncrewed. So even if the enemy or the other country finds them, it's unlikely to lead to war. It's unlikely to even lead to an international incident in the way that a crewed submarine would. And the example there we'd use, of course, is the famous Russian submarine that grounded itself off a Swedish naval base in 1981, the Whiskey on the Rocks incident. It's a Whiskey-class submarine. If that happens today, it's very embarrassing. If it's a UUV, it barely meets, even the headlines. Even local newspapers probably don't care. In China, they're finding a large number of UUVs. Now, in reality, most of the ones that they find are not in any way interesting. It's just things that wash up on the beach. But they're interesting. They actually reward fishermen for finding them because they're expecting that people will be using UUVs to gather data on them.
So how does a UUV transmit its information? UAVs in the sky will always find it quite easy to transmit their information, as they can either beam it to a satellite in space above them or to a receiver on the ground below them. But these UUVs can often be quite deep underwater, and transmitting through water is far more difficult than transmitting through air. So if my UUV is sitting, let's say, on the seabed of the entrance to the submarine pens in Hainan, how does it let me know that a certain Chinese sub is leaving the port that day? How does it beam its information?
There's a few different ways it can work. Absolutely, you can come to the surface and broadcast the information. In general, that's going to get you detected, or at least it stands a higher chance of getting detected. It's a less robust way to do it, and it's like to use a lot of energy over time if you keep coming to the surface and keep broadcasting. More realistically, for these types of mission, if the data is not time critical, they will return back to a safe location and either transmit and wait to be recovered, or better still, sail all the way back to your home port and just return. Obviously, that requires a lot of range, so you end up with something in the middle where they're recovered by another boat out in international waters, and they then download the data. In some respects, underwater communication is possible, but it is definitely the weakness, and it's much harder. It's the last option would be to transmit underwater.
Well, speaking of underwater communications, one of the major uses for UUVs that people talk about is as an offensive weapon against underwater internet cables. What some people may not know is all of our internet is actually mostly connected through underwater cables, which largely sit on the seabed floor completely unguarded. So China could, as a hypothetical for instance, lay a bunch of UUVs on sections of these miles-long internet cables that connect Taiwan to the outside world, and then sever them all at once in the opening stages of an invasion, cutting off the internet for the majority of people on Taiwan, causing massive outages across all sorts of sectors in their economy, and massive communication issues right across the military command. Are we likely to see things like underwater internet infrastructure becoming part of the targets for UUVs in the future?
It is absolutely an obvious use of AUVs. In any hot war scenario with Taiwan, I think it's very obvious that they would go after those cables. And Taiwan, being an island like other islands, and being very connected to the world for commerce and also communication, it would be very vulnerable to it. And in particular, there's cables between Taiwan and America, which are very vulnerable and might have political implications for America as well as locally for Taiwan. Could be much more strategic targets. I think it's obvious that China would go after these. And although it's very hard to guess or consider what the impact is, it can't be good.
And there is talk that China already tampers with these cables, using their UUVs to tap into the cables between Taiwan and the US to eavesdrop on communication between the two and gather up data. But what do you think the likelihood of that actually happening at the moment is?
People have been tapping into them and listening to them for some time. There's technology discussed, methods discussed in public, in academia. In general, if you're going to tap it undersea, there has to be a reason that you wouldn't do it above land. On land, it's going to be a lot easier. But yes, they can be tapped.
Is there a way of actually defending these cables from UUV attacks? Or frankly, these cables are miles and miles long, and there just isn't the infrastructure to defend every inch of it?
It's potentially an arms race where the country that's threatening the infrastructure has an advantage, because all they've got to do is threaten it, and it will cost a lot of money to defend and prepare defenses. Having said that, it's worth doing, and we're still exploring that, and I think it's untested. Obviously, within NATO, particularly in Europe, people are waking up and starting to invest in ships and coordination centers and things like this, which is a really positive step. But from a defense analysis perspective, the jury's still out. It's something we will learn about as it evolves. And to be honest, it might actually move quicker than our thinking on it, and we'll be catching up.
We've been talking about China for a little while now, but where do they actually sit in the submarine race compared to nations like Russia or the US?
So for seabed warfare, I'd say that the country with the natural advantage is Russia. They are much more invested in it than any other country. The only country that comes anywhere close would be the United States. And for comparison, the United States has one special mission submarine currently. It might have two in future, whereas China has a fleet of them and lots of other ships, and has its own branch of the Navy that is dedicated to seabed warfare and has had for decades. So Russia is definitely the country most focused on it and with the most assets. Having said that, Russia is not the most advanced technologically on it anymore, because they lost ground following the end of the Cold War. On the AUVs, they're slightly behind maybe in individual designs, but in general terms, I'd put them ahead. The country that's moving the fastest on AUVs in general would be China. A few years ago, I'd have a different answer. The United States, and then subsequently Britain, and then subsequently countries such as Australia, Japan, France, have been moving towards ever larger and more capable AUVs. What's happened is that China in the background has actually also been working on those, and it hasn't been advertising it. We only know about this from observing it. We don't know the names of the programs, but we know that they've got more in the water. They've got at least 5 extra large uncrewed underwater vehicles. I would think that they'll also have an advantage, not just in the scale of their projects and their ambition, and that they will probably build them in more numbers than anyone else, but they're going to end up with designs that were unsuccessful for their own programs that they could export. So we could see China having a very big advantage on the export market, and that is what could actually change the dynamics of which navies have how much power essentially in the future. So China, I think, is definitely the country to watch. If you talk about submarines, we think of Chinese submarines being somewhat behind lead other countries, including Russia and United States, Britain, France, and so on. And that is true. The Chinese submarines have been catching up, but they're still behind. AUVs is different. Although for sure a few years ago, China was absorbing a lot of Western AUV technology, and that no doubt helps them. In general, they're not starting the AUV race 10, 20 years behind everyone else like they did with submarines. They're starting at about the same time. And a lot of the technologies they need are things that China is good at. I think their disadvantages are likely to be around the Navy itself and how well it integrates its platforms. It could still be a slight disadvantage to some leading navies around the world, such as US Navy. But in general terms, China is catching up so quickly, I would say that they could very quickly be ahead if other countries don't respond in the same way.
So let's say the US does respond in a big way. What are the bottlenecks when it comes to UUV research at the moment? What prevents us getting to that next point?
Yeah, there's a few characteristics that it feels like we're on the cusp of the change, but the barriers so far have largely been underwater communications. That is the main difference between air vehicles and submarines. So uncrewed submarines versus uncrewed aircraft. UAVs, the aircraft front, has really changed in the last 20, 30 years. Of course, there have been ones before that, but suddenly drones are being used to strike targets and so on. And the reason they can do that is because communication is so much better. You imagine a drone pilot sitting in somewhere in America in a desert, dropping missiles on someone else in another desert thousands and thousands of miles away. You can't do that with submersibles underwater. Communication is so much harder. So therefore, automation becomes more important. And as you know, the automation front is changing very, very rapidly. AI is much more achievable. And those levels of automation are starting to come in. And that's what's really going to change, revolutionize even, the usefulness of uncrewed underwater vehicles. So that's been the main barrier. Other barriers, of course, have simply been things like propulsion and batteries. Lithium-ion batteries make it much, much better. And that's been around for a few years now, but that really is the way forward with AUVs. Of course, the bigger ones have fuel cells or have diesel electric engines, potentially even nuclear, of course. So that's been a barrier. But really, it's the biggest ones are underwater communications and the automation that makes up for the lack of underwater communication.
And if these communication issues could be solved, does that enable them to be used much more like we use a UAV at the moment? Could we see swarms of UUVs being used to attack US carriers, for an example?
Yes, largely it does. But at the moment, it's very difficult to coordinate swarms of small AUVs in the way that you do air vehicles. And it is communication. For swarms, or rather for the best types of swarms, it's two-way communication. They're coordinating among each other, they're sharing information, situational awareness, so on. It requires a lot of data to be moving securely, reliably, and you don't want the swarms attacking themselves. So identification, friend or foe. That is so much harder underwater, and that is a main barrier to using swarms. Having said that, I'm sure that people are working on the problem and coming at it from both ends. On the one end, those barriers will reduce as technologies improve, underwater communications and so on, but also coming at it from the other approach, finding ways to make it work despite those limitations. Having said that, although swarms are definitely a valid tactic, even one single AUV is still useful and could potentially even have strategic impact in some scenarios. So swarms are very hard. I think they will come, but even if they don't, it won't necessarily stop AUVs becoming more and more important in naval warfare.
So how do you see these UUVs being used in the case of a war in the very near future?
If we play through the most popular and perhaps most likely major confrontations that might occur, Taiwan, most obvious one. In a Taiwan scenario today versus 10 years ago, massive difference in the use of uncrewed underwater vehicles. We can assume that China would deploy a very large number of AUVs, and some of those could, for example, be placing mines in, and this is just one scenario, but in choke points in Indonesia, for example, which would potentially prevent other countries using those transits to get troops, supplies to Taiwan. Equally, they could be attacking undersea cables, which would be, it gives them a much more realistic way to do that than crewed submersibles or surface ships. And we could see them just being used just as part of regular operations, whether it's landing operations or reconnaissance. They will be everywhere in the way that uncrewed air vehicles are already. Another scenario that's quite different would be a future small war, the sort of thing where a leading power is up against a much smaller, less developed navy, and it's essentially a proxy war. And these happened throughout the Cold War a lot. They were never anti-submarine warfare games. The leading country with using its ships, you know, if you think back to Vietnam, for example, the Australian Navy and the US Navy sailed a lot of ships into Vietnam with supplies, you know, to take part in the fighting. They weren't overly concerned about submarines. AUVs could change that. These small countries, especially if they're client states of China, could acquire uncrewed underwater vehicles very easily and bring them up to speed much faster and with much less resource footprint than crewed submarines. It's not realistic that you can supply a crewed submarine to a small navy and that they convert it to a meaningful capability overnight, whereas an AUV could turn up in a lorry and be a combat capability the next day. There's a massive difference in the infrastructure, the training, the resources required to deploy these. So it could actually change the nature of those small wars, perhaps in a bigger way than it does the big wars.
So UUVs look poised to change the battlefield in the same way that UAVs have done over the last decade, with UAVs enabling even lower or middle class powers to order lethal and effective drones that are much cheaper than anything they could have ever afforded before, greatly bolstering their air power. Even nations like Kyrgyzstan, who could never really hope to afford fighter jets, now has its own fleet of Turkish Bayraktar drones. And when we've seen a bigger nation like Russia go up against a smaller nation like Ukraine, even when Russia's had a much, much larger air force, and has poured billions into having much better fighter capabilities, it's these new drones that have just hit the market in the last few years that seem to be dominating the skies above the battlefield. Drones democratize the skies and change the battlefield forever. So are we about to see the same thing happen here under the water? Are UUVs the next game changer in warfare? Well, to answer that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. The Blue Water Bayraktar.
Unmanned underwater vehicles, or UUVs, are essential elements in providing militaries with underwater surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities. They can essentially dive at different depths. They can carry different sensor packages, such as just cameras for observation, or they can be potentially armed for combat. There are different classes and types of UUVs, and a lot of militaries are building these different types for different mission sets, from those that operate near the surface to those that operate very deep below the surface. In the war in Ukraine has shown that UUVs don't have to be very expensive devices, and they can actually be fielded relatively quickly in combat.
Samuel Bendet is an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, with his research primarily focusing on Russia's defense and technology developments, with particular interest in uncrewed, robotic, and autonomous military systems, as well as artificial intelligence. Prior to joining CNA, Bendet also worked for the National Defense University on emerging and disruptive technologies, and has also served as a foreign policy advisor for everyone from the private sector to the US Congress. And we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
Well, the number one advantage is, of course, you don't have to use people in underwater operations. In order to staff a submarine, you need to spend a lot of resources to design and build and field a submarine. You have to teach personnel, and military personnel especially, and sailors, how to operate a sub. It takes years, sometimes decades, for submarine operations to become very effective. With unmanned underwater vehicle, you can just field one technology. It could be remote piloted. Sometimes it could be autonomously piloted or autonomously operated, as some militaries claim. Again, it takes people out of the equation. UUVs are generally smaller than submarines. They're not as expensive. In fact, they could be very cheap when compared to similar types of operations performed even by small staffed submarines. And they can be built in large numbers, and they could be operated from a single vessel, either below or above the surface, or even sometimes from the air. And they can cover significant areas. Again, taking the people out of the equation, taking people out of dangerous missions. And there are different types of missions designed for UUVs. Again, for observation, for surveillance and reconnaissance, for mimicking the adversary, for attacking the adversary, for guard duties, such as guarding ports and other locations, and many other types of mission sets.
So can you take us through some of the advantages here? Why would you send a UUV to guard a port rather than sending a conventional manned submarine?
Well, why would I use a multi-billion-dollar submarine for guarding a port? Really, multi-billion-dollar submarines are usually sent out to patrol the high seas and the oceans for long-range mission sets that can last many, many months. If I have a UUV that could just be, let's say, 10 to 15 feet long with cameras and sensors, then I can field several of them to be in the water basically around the clock to protect a specific location, to guard a specific location. Again, the advantage of UUVs is their cost and relative ease of operation when compared to any type of a manned asset, such as a naval vessel or an actual naval submarine that has to be staffed by sailors. US submarines can cost in the billions of dollars, especially the more advanced ones. The UUVs, the heavy UUVs, can cost, let's say, in the millions as far as the higher cost ceiling is concerned. So we're talking about any given UUV, no matter how large or sophisticated, as a fraction of a cost of any type of manned asset. Now, we do have to acknowledge that some navies operate very small submarines, like North Korea, for example, and Iran. They have small submarines with very small crews that have limited range and limited capacity. But again, any type of UUV is probably more advantageous to use in different types of missions because of their cost. However, we have to acknowledge that there are different mission sets for different types of UUVs. Some are very light and very small and just carry a small sensor package. Others can be designed to carry torpedoes and bombs. So, of course, any manned submarine is going to carry a lot of weapons, way more weapons and systems that can be potentially carried right now by a UUV. But many militaries around the world are designing heavier systems, heavier unmanned underwater vehicles that can carry a significant military complement, such as torpedoes, such as bombs, such as missiles.
Which countries do you feel are the cutting edge of this field?
If we look at the overall market and overall development of different types of unmanned underwater vessels, both light and small and heavier ones, several countries basically come to mind. United States and China are developing different types of systems. Russia, of course, is building on its decades-long experience with submarine warfare by also building and designing heavy and mid-range unmanned underwater vehicles. When we talk about who is ahead, many different designs that it is claiming can be operational. Right now, a lot of Russian resources are devoted to the war in Ukraine. At the same time, Russia is boasting of having a nuclear-armed unmanned underwater vehicle that is supposed to be tested sometime this year or early next year. So sometimes it's difficult to sort of confirm the veracity of claims by different countries. But United States and China have been public in demonstrating different types of UUVs that have been tested by different companies and different organizations for different mission sets. Other countries are also probably building and designing this, countries like Iran, countries like Turkey. There are countries in Western Europe that are also devoting resources to the development of UUVs. As far as the usefulness of this technology is concerned, many nations with significant experience in building different types of vessels are also going to devote resources to such technology, such as South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan.
What do you think the likely main roles for UUVs will be going forward?
Well, specifically talking about Russia's Poseidon unmanned underwater vehicle, it is claimed to be an offensive weapon. Russians are claiming that it can go relatively fast at significant depths and can deliver a nuclear strike, for example, cause a tsunami that will carry radioactive waste against shore-based cities and facilities. That is, of course, a claim. It's unproven. Right now, Russians, again, are claiming that they're going to test. But again, there are different UUV mission sets. And so many, even large and heavy UUVs are designed for observation, for monitoring the underwater designated areas. Some of these UUVs can be equipped with missiles and torpedoes. Russians, for example, are working on a design called a surrogate, which is going to mimic Russian submarines in electronic and acoustic signatures to fool Western and other submarines. Or it can mimic, for example, any submarine around the world for training and evaluation by the Russian Navy.
With the much lower price tag of UUVs, are we likely to see the market for submarines open up to a much wider set of countries? The countries that could never hope to afford a massive nuclear submarine now might have access to UUVs for a much, much lower price tag, in the same way that UAVs and drones like the Iranian Shahed or the Turkish Bayraktar have made it possible for much smaller powers to possess their own air combat systems. Do you see this same phenomenon happening here in the water with UUVs?
It is quite possible. There are multiple UUV designs which can be acquired already at a relatively cheap cost by multiple militaries. In fact, a lot of these UUVs are actually tethered, and so they're used for sort of short-range observation of a specific designated object or a given area. So any military that wants to have a UUV can actually acquire one. It is likely that many countries are going to sort of look at market leaders or some of the breakthrough leaders in this field to see if they can actually acquire this capability. Of course, the big question is, what are those UUVs needed for, right? And whether a military actually needs to acquire this capacity in the first place, which is why so few countries around the world are actually fielding submarines, for example, because they have a mission for them. And the question then becomes, what kind of requirements will exist with militaries around the world for them to actually acquire this type of technology? But again, as this technology becomes more widespread, as it becomes cheaper, as more countries enter the market and are presenting their own solutions, then it is likely that this technology will also proliferate the way unmanned aerial vehicles have over the past decade.
When it comes to the actual UUVs themselves, are they much harder to find than a conventional sub? And do you think nations will prioritize spending a bit more and making them more stealthy, or frankly keeping them cheap enough that if they lose a couple, well, it won't matter that much?
They are relatively small in size. The smallest one can be just several feet in length. Some of the larger ones can be just 10 or 15 or no more than 20 feet in length. And these are a lot more difficult to find and identify below the waves than any even smaller manned submarine, which has to have the length of at least 70 to 80 feet. Again, any small object in the water is difficult to identify. And the key to identification, of course, is how this object moves and how it tries to communicate with operators or with other systems below and above the waves, whether those systems are also autonomous or crewed. And so the more autonomous a UUV is, the more it resembles basically other living things in the ocean, both in size and in operation. And so identifying them can be actually quite difficult.
Can you take us through what seabed warfare is likely to look like with this increased prevalence of UUVs?
Seabed warfare is basically operation around the ocean floor. Right now, of course, using submarines for seabed missions is also dangerous because anything can happen to this technology at great depths. And I think the key to using UUVs in this type of mission sets is, again, taking the human out of the equation, taking the human out of very dangerous missions, and building the cost of UUVs into their potential loss or destruction. As far as warfare is concerned, I think we have to take into consideration what kind of missions are going to be required of both submarines and complementary technologies like the UUVs. But what the UUVs can do is they can generate false signals, for example, mimicking submarines, adversarial submarines. They can generate false targets, which will force either the attacker or the defender to reveal their position in order to try to identify and target these false targets. If the UUVs are going to be armed with missiles or torpedoes or even explosive, they're going to present multiple dangerous targets for anyone that is trying to defend against them. And of course, given the fact that some of these UUVs could actually be relatively small in size, would make it very difficult to identify them. And so there's a lot of resources today devoted to both understanding how this type of warfare will be conducted with these type of technologies and how to better and properly defend themselves against these type of technologies.
So if you were in charge of a large or middle power navy like the US or Australia, would you be doubling down on conventional or very large submarines, or would you be starting to divert more of your military budget towards multiple UUVs for the price you pay for a single conventional sub?
I think that's a fair question and really depends on a specific navy in question. There's still a lot of fallback to known technologies, to existing technologies that have proven themselves in combat, which is why a lot of countries are actually buying submarines for current or future warfare. But it is likely that every navy is also looking at the development of these alternative complementary technologies like UUVs. How useful can they be in combat? How useful they can be for different types of mission sets? Right now, a lot of this technology is not quite mature. In fact, there's only a handful of countries that I mentioned that actually build and operate such systems. So it's not like there's an equivalent of a Chinese-made DJI Mavic drone in the UUV world right now. The technologies are still sort of getting perfected. They're still getting tested. So right now, the technology isn't quite there yet for a lot of militaries to consider them as key assets. But as the technology matures, as it becomes more and more sophisticated, while at the same time, as the cost for development and procurement of these technologies is getting lower and lower because of the improvements in hardware and software in general, then a lot more militaries are going to look at UUVs as a potential complement to their existing or future forces.
What would you say to an analyst who calls UUVs nothing more than a fad, claiming that their likely future is to be confined to little more than just cheap recon missions? What would be your pushback to that statement?
I think a lot will depend on how they're going to be used and by what nations. Right now, for example, if we look at Ukraine has demonstrated that it can build and field a number of autonomous and uncrewed technologies for maritime operations. And it can build cheap, for example, unmanned surface vessels. I know we're not talking about surface vessels, but Ukraine has built and fielded different types of USVs, unmanned surface vehicles, together with UAVs to actually create a significant problem for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So the Ukrainian use of these USVs is a fraction of the cost of Russia trying to defend against them, for example, in combat. And a lot of navies, a lot of militaries are looking at what Ukrainians have done with respect to USVs. When we're going to get a actual military deployment of different UUV types in combat, I think this will make a lot of countries, a lot of experts, a lot of specialists really take notice. Again, the real reason for using UUVs is taking humans out of dangerous equations, while at the same time ensuring that operating UUVs can create just as much effect as with manned and crewed vessels. And so a lot of countries are developing these technologies right now. I think we're kind of past the point of this being a fad, with so many nations looking at UUVs as complementary technologies to their existing navies. We're going to see a significant growth in these technologies in the coming years and decades.
Getting fooled or missing a trend once is somewhat understandable, but getting fooled twice, well, that's just being foolish. You see, not everybody saw the impact that UAVs would have on the battlefield coming, and while some analysts touted the success of drones based on US operations in Afghanistan and Pakistan, for others, the price tag was still far too high to become mainstream across militaries. For a lot of us, myself included, it was the cheaper drones like the TB2 who for just a fraction of the price managed to halt Haftar's advance around Tripoli, obliterated the Armenian tanks in Karabakh, and pulverized the Russian supply lines in Ukraine, that really make a lot of us sit up and take notice at just what UAVs were capable of. Now, after the recent successes of USVs in the Black Sea and UUVs cutting internet cables in the North Sea, nations outside of the big players are starting to sit up and pay attention as to just what UUVs are capable of. But which countries are becoming the early adopters? And how is the procurement of these changing the structure of their naval forces? Well, to answer that, we'll turn to our final guest.
Part 3. High-pressure hostiles.
Well, let's start with why the naval domain is so important. We're looking at a situation in which the two most powerful militaries and two most powerful countries in the world are separated by 8,000 miles of water. And the Pacific Ocean, the space between the west coast of the United States and the east coast of China, I think is set to be the zone of great power competition in the coming period, with places like the Luzon Strait, south of the Philippines, serving the same role in the new geopolitical disposition as the Fulda Pass played in the Cold War, these kind of critical places where China and the United States will encounter one another. The 8,000 miles of water doesn't sound like much. In fact, the quantity of space between San Diego and Shanghai, let's say, is roughly the same as all continents combined. So we're talking about a simply vast territory. To map that, to track it, to sense it, and ultimately to fight it is going to be an extraordinarily complicated and an extraordinarily sophisticated venture. And what we're seeing is increasingly that submarines, the subsea space, is going to play a crucial role in any potential fight there.
Bruce Jones is a senior fellow at the Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. He also works with the Center for East Asia Policy Studies and is also a consulting professor at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University, with Bruce's research expertise focusing on US strategy, international order, and great power relations.
A fleet, half of them are allocated to Northern European waters to keep track of Russian nuclear launch capable submarines. That gives me about 30 submarines to keep track of China's rapidly expanding fleet. I have to send them over several thousand miles before they're in zones that are relevant for tracking the Chinese fleet or playing any other role. So this capability, which is an enormously expensive capability, is going to get stretched very thin very quickly. The United States has already launched a new program to recapitalize its fleet of nuclear launch submarines. It's expanding its fleet of fast attack submarines, but that's a very expensive and a very slow process. UUVs give me the capability to track movements, to diversify my sensors, to map ports, deep sea channels, shoals, all sorts of different things at a fraction of the price of a submarine fleet.
Obviously, there'll be lots of other players entering this space in the near term, but for now, let's just focus on the big three in UUVs: the US, Russia, and China. Do you think these three players are likely to use their UUVs in a relatively similar manner, or are they more likely to use their UUV fleets in a much more tailored doctrine? And if so, how do those doctrines differ from each other?
We're seeing several navies compete here. It's the three you mentioned. It's the Russians, it's the Americans, and the Chinese, but it's also the Brits, the French, the Koreans, the Indians, the Japanese. Every major player in the sort of geopolitical race in the Western Pacific is investing in the UUV space. Russia, China, and the United States maybe have a little bit of an edge, but not that big of an edge. Technologically, India is doing some interesting things. The Koreans are doing interesting things. The French have useful drones. They play very different roles in different navies. The essential difference here is a simple one. The United States has to be prepared to fight 7,000, 7,500, 8,000 miles from its shore. China is going to be taking this fight 80 to 100 to 120 miles from its shore. Those are fundamentally different. So for China, what we've seen so far is the really heavy investment in the UUV spaces in deep sea mapping. And I would say probably ahead of the curve of everybody else there in terms of the scope, the quantity, the sophistication of the deep sea mapping. The United States might be a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of multi-use drones, the extra large UUV, the Orca class. Some countries are contemplating this as extensions of weapon systems. Some are contemplating this as extensions of special forces operators systems. Everybody is using it for intelligence gathering, data collection. I think we're going to start to see a lot in terms of diversified and dispersed sensors. If we end up in a naval battle in the Western Pacific, there will be a huge focus on electromagnetic warfare, information warfare, disruption of sensing, disruption of mapping, the ability to get a lot more sensors to a lot more places in less vulnerable ways, smaller targets. That's going to be very attractive. So we're going to see the United States doing a lot of that. For China, we'll see UUVs playing important roles in anti-submarine warfare and tracking. But so far, we're also seeing this very important deep sea mapping role where China really is in the lead.
For Chinese combat operations, how do these UUVs fit into China's seabed warfare strategy?
This is very experimental and much of it is deeply classified. What we do know is that China is experimenting with deep sea mines, with deep sea energy clusters, basically using the deep sea area as a comparative advantage. The United States obviously has a significant advantage in the technology of the submarine fleet. So China's really looking to use the very deep sea space as a domain in which it can develop an advantage for tracking American submarines, potentially for mining, in ways that would disrupt, diminish the technological lead that the United States has in the submarine space per se, in terms of actual fighting submarines. Again, it's pretty clear to me that they see significant advantages in having better mapping and more maneuverability in that very deep sea space, and they really are ahead of the curve here. By the way, there's also a very important commercial dimension to this, which is around deep sea mining. That is probably less immediately the UUV space. The UUV space is more in the military zone so far, but we may well see the application of UUVs to deep sea mining. There's an awful lot of strategic metals and minerals on the seabed floor at pretty large depths, and we may see UUVs playing an important role there too.
Another important resource sitting on the sea floor are the internet cables that connect Taiwan to the rest of the world, something many analysts are predicting will become a target of Chinese UUVs in any opening strike against Taiwan by the PRC. To give us a sense of why this is so important to the conversation, what effect do you think this would have if they were cut in the opening hours of any conflict between the two?
Undersea cables are globalization's most important network and its most vulnerable network. It's quite astonishing. More than 90% of all the data that flows worldwide flows on those cables. This conversation we're having now wouldn't be possible without them. Every time you use your ATM or check your iPhone, you're tapping into flows of information that move in those cables. They're barely protected. In lots of different countries, you can walk right up to their landing station. There's very little security around these. Multi-government ownership, private sector ownership, they have not been conceptualized as national security assets. So they're incredibly vulnerable. Now, the challenge comes in the reciprocal nature of connectivity. When you look at the China-Taiwan scenario, where China could sever connectivity ties to Taiwan, if we end up in a naval fight in the Taiwan Straits, which hopefully we won't, but if we do, the possibility of severing of those cables is pretty high. Those are pretty shallow waters in a lot of places. It's not going to take a lot to end up severing cables.
We actually have already seen this cable cutting playing out in real life, with the Russians cutting some of the undersea cables in the Arctic Sea. You see, in 2020, after a Russian submarine collided with the British ship HMS Bedfordshire, the Russians became quite annoyed and retaliated a few days later by severing the internet cables connecting Norway to its Arctic archipelago, Svalbard, the cables that supply the entire archipelago with internet and data. But whilst the cable does supply people who live in Svalbard with their ability to watch Netflix, the cable also provides NATO with all of their Arctic sensor data that monitors Russian subs leaving their Arctic bases. So in one fell swoop, NATO lost the ability to check Russian subs coming out of the Arctic and connect with their personnel on Svalbard. To defense analysts, this was a big moment and signaled a big step that civilian infrastructure was now free to target. Now, if you're wondering why you've never heard about this incident, it's because the event took place on January 6, 2020. And on that date, Washington and the global media was somewhat distracted with another story at the time. Regardless of which, now the Russians have shown what cutting these cables can actually do, and how much chaos a simple sever can cause. So how is NATO responding to this, and what are they going to try and do to counter it in the future?
Remember that Russia still has, say, clearly the second most sophisticated submarine fleet in the world. Not quite as sophisticated as the United States, but it's pretty damn close. More sophisticated than China's. And what it has been doing over the last year or so is essentially signaling to Europe that Europe's undersea infrastructure is extremely vulnerable. It's not only data cables, it's energy cables, it's electrical cables. There's a whole host of things that rely on undersea infrastructure, and it's pretty vulnerable. You are watching the Europeans reanimate some capabilities for anti-submarine warfare as a result. But Russia has a lot of capability here, and I think we'll see as if we end up in a second phase of the Ukraine war where things start to look like we might be moving towards a war termination phase or Russiaing its submarine muscles, which are pretty substantial, in the Baltics, in the Arctic, in the Barents Sea, maybe in the North Atlantic. We've already seen some movements in the North Atlantic. The most important effect of that, in my mind, is pulling American capacity away from the Western Pacific, where obviously the Chinese are building out their fleet at a very rapid rate. We've spent the last 40 years proliferating these cables, and we haven't been worried about protection in these kinds of terms. There are hundreds of them. So I don't think the answer is going to lie primarily in physical protection, although we will see some of that. NATO has just created a new center to develop responses for physical protection of cables. There can be some of that, but how do you protect thousands of miles of cable along the seabed floor of the Pacific? You can't do that. So it's really going to have to be in the response and the deterrent side that the real work will be done. There can be physical protection as the cables come close to shore. You can make sure that Russian submarines aren't coming that close to shore in a variety of ways. But at the seabed level, I don't really think that physical protection is going to be how we get this done.
So what about other underwater infrastructure? It's like the argument, gas pipelines going through the Baltic Sea. Are UUVs capable of targeting something like that?
Yeah, well, this is when I was referring to energy infrastructure. That was what I was thinking about. Gas pipelines that crisscross the Baltics. Those are pretty vulnerable too. That's not the only geography where those matter, of course. So yes, absolutely. We can easily see UUVs being used in that way. There are navies developing UUVs to be essentially subsea missiles. Some of them are designed to be sort of work together with torpedoes. Some of them are designed to be platforms in their own right. We could easily see them being used that way.
What are the current rules or legislation around private UUVs? If a hypothetical energy company was to build their own submarine to target a rival player's underwater infrastructure, what laws are currently on the books to prevent this?
It's not a very regulated space because it hasn't been a thing. Just a handful of scientific UUVs in the hands of very responsible actors, major oceanographic institutions, for example. But as we see it developing in the commercial space, this is going to have to be a zone for significant new regulation, both at the national level and at the level of the International Maritime Organization. How much that will be enforced, that's a bit hard to tell. One of the challenges, of course, is that some of these can be relatively small. You can have hundreds of them. If a state doesn't want to enforce regulation in its commercial sector, it's going to be very hard to track these things. So it could be a domain of significant gaps in regulation, hardly the only maritime space that has major gaps in regulation.
Is there a concern within the defense community that due to the low barrier to entry and the low price tag, that these may just be used as swarm weapons rather than any sort of accuracy? As an example, China could launch 10,000 small UUVs packed with explosives toward a fully stocked Ford-class carrier, and even if they lose all 10,000 UUVs, taking the carrier down, they'd actually still come out financially ahead. So is there a worry about future swarm tactics being used by states like China who might be able to manufacture these cheaply and in mass production?
So far, the range of these things, the ones that are small, the range is pretty limited. They use energy, they have to be refueled or restocked. So I think the sense that has been developed that you can very readily and very cheaply have literally thousands of these things swarming, I think is exaggerated. I think it's much more likely that we'll see smaller numbers of that than that working closer to existing platforms. So in my mind, the future of this is really not about large numbers of UUVs and swarms operating independently. It's really about the combination of manned systems and unmanned systems.
What do you think is the big upcoming innovation that will take UUVs to the next level on this? What is the big breakthrough we're all waiting for?
I do think it's the combination of manned-unmanned. So it's less a sort of major technological breakthrough than it is a doctrinal and a practice breakthrough. I think if we start to see significant manned-unmanned use, we'll see the expansion of capabilities, especially around the ability of submarines to serve as information hubs and sensing hubs and communicate out to other parts of a joint fighting system without revealing themselves. I think that one has a lot of potential. To go back to your earlier point, you could imagine a substantial number of these, not fully autonomous, but somewhat autonomous, carrying nuclear weapons, adding to the third leg of the nuclear triad. I could imagine that, but that's a numbers game, not a transformations game. That is what I anticipate being the next major development in warfare in these domains.
Do you anticipate a lot of the middle and upper middle powers beginning to shift their naval spending away from larger capital ships and towards cheaper UUVs? In much the same way we've seen numerous middle powers starting to pivot away from buying just a handful of very good fighters and towards a fleet of more economical drones. Is this a phenomenon that's on its way to the naval theater as well?
What unmanned drones in the air have done have given us the ability to fight at great distances without significant other presences, but only in very limited forms of warfare. Right? And we've done that in the counterterrorism warfare. If you look at what happened in Ukraine, if you look to the way Turkey has used these, etc., it really is, again, about combining these unmanned systems with more traditional manned systems. That's really been the use case in terms of conflict between middle powers or major powers. And so I really do think that that's where this will develop when we start to see significant numbers of unmanned platforms and then unmanned sensors linked up to the existing platforms. That's really where we'll start to see transformations in the type of war that we can fight in this domain.
So to some, we appear to be at the cusp of a new age of naval warfare, a democratization of the seas. As with the lowering of costs, more and more players now have the ability to enter the submarine space. We're entering a period of transition where submarines move from being the ultimate superweapon only possessed by the most spectacular of navies to likely 2/3 of the world's navies possessing some sort of underwater weapon. A world where one can park their UUV at a key strategic point for years at a time, whether that be on top of a pipeline, or the entrance to a harbour, on top of the country's key internet cables, or even at the base of their dams. Just laying there, dormant and waiting for that moment when the Rona decides to launch the attack. But don't get me wrong though, I'm not against UUVs. I think they have amazing potential to carry out absolutely crucial missions without having to put any sailors' lives at risk. But what I do worry about is that some nations may not realize how quickly things are about to change. Remember that it was only a couple of years between drones being a weapon of maybe the top 20 economies to one that became widely accessible to all sorts of nations, once priced well outside that market. I've said on the show before, and I will say it one more time, wars are fought second on the battlefield, but first in the Excel spreadsheets. And how effectively your country spends each and every defense dollar they have is what wins or loses you wars. And with these leaps and bounds in UUV capabilities we're seeing recently, maybe it's time we start re-examining the formulas on our Navy's spreadsheets. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. I've been pitching this episode about UUVs to the team for almost a year now, and with the recent events, it's obvious why we took an interest in it. And it makes me incredibly happy that we could start our second 100 episodes with something pretty awesome. But that's not the only bit of good news we have coming up. And in fact, in the next few weeks, we have a series of very big announcements to make here on the show. So stay tuned for that one. If you do want to be notified straight away when we do make those announcements, you can find all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeHilliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show is completely funded by our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep this show going. And speaking of amazing Patreons, I want to thank David Schroeder from the good friends over at the Cold War, KBH, Matt Brannon, Nicola Lizald, Stuart Schroff, Dave Compton, Jordan, Ragnar Ragnars, Max Trevina, Jonathan Stefiani, and Frida Anderson, who are the latest patrons to sign up as of time of recording. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like these guys, whose donations help keep this show going. So if you have a couple of dollars you feel you could spare, want to be part of our Patreon events or have access to transcripts or special bonuses, you can sign up to our Patreon for just a few dollars a month. But for now, this episode on UUVs is all thanks to you guys. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first is Understanding Naval Warfare by Ian Speller, for an idea of all the key factors that a modern Navy has to plan for and consider. The second is Kill Chain, The Rise of High-Tech Assassins by Andrew Coburn, for a look at the rise of the UAV program. And the third is US Naval Power in the 21st Century, a new strategy for facing the Chinese and Russian threat, for an insight into where US policymakers feel the upcoming challenges might be. I want to thank this week's guests, H.I. Sutton, Samuel Bendett, and Bruce Jones. All of you were absolutely fantastic to have on this episode, and we can't wait to work with you again. I also want to thank my staff, starting with the primary researchers for this episode, Genevieve Dodland-May and Raul Devanarayanan. The research done for this episode was some of the most thorough I've ever seen, and I can't thank them enough for all the effort they put into this one. In addition to them, I'd also like to thank the rest of my team, Wade McCarr, the producer, Barry Grace, Daniela Zuvella, Nate Ostiller, Nick McNally, Sean Cotter-Lem, Isaac Gibbs, Ahmad Al-Ahmad, Andrew Garbery, Scott Missler-Ferguson, and Robbie Sutton, our research assistants and writers, Jamie Tanu, our media director, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Ross Crabtree, our media advisor, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. The Red Line will be back in another fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.